The next matter we wanted to raise is same-sex marriage, on which the Constitution only mentions in section 51, placetum 21, that's the general powers to the Commonwealth, which are shared with the states, that where the Commonwealth may prevail, there's a power to make laws with respect to marriage. I cite here what appears in Quick and Garran, the book on the Constitution, which in a comment on that says that this means, according to the law of England, a marriage is a union between a man and a woman on the same basis as that on which the institution is recognised throughout Christendom. And its essence is that it is 1, a voluntary union, 2, for life, 3, of one man and one woman, 4, to the exclusion of all others. And then note section 51(22), the next placetum. There's a power with respect to divorce and matrimonial causes. There's a recognition that although marriage is a voluntary union for life, it can be dissolved. And in 2013, a case came before the High Court. This resulted from the Howard government's legislation. The Howard government amended the Marriage Act to provide that marriage is a union between one man and one woman for life, to the exclusion of others. That contradicted legislation introduced in the ACT, a territory, to introduce same-sex marriage. The High Court found that that was invalid, but at the same time they gave unanimous advice in their decision that it would be within the powers of the federal parliament to legislate, to introduce same-sex marriage, because the meaning of marriage had changed. So it goes very much to the meaning of words in a constitution, and I can't help but note the big dispute in the United States recently, where Antonin Scalia, who died and who thereby created a vacancy in the court, became a major subject in the last election, where he argued essentially that the Constitution means what a reasonable person thought it meant at the time the Constitution was entered into. So the big question is really, is the Constitution a living document? Does it change as words change? Or does it mean that it means what the Founding Fathers intended and a reasonable person at the time intended? What are the options? Well, we could have had, but we're not apparently, we could have had a referendum. The referendum is, of course, under Australian law, the voting there is compulsory, but that's not in the Constitution. Normally it's passed, the bill is passed by both houses, though there is a provision for it to be passed by just one house. Under legislation, there's always a yes-no booklet if the parliament is divided. And of course, a referendum must be approved nationally and in a majority of states. The next alternative, the next option, is a legislated, non-binding consultative plebiscite, which the government proposed and introduced, which would introduce into the House and then the Senate. It would have been compulsory to be approved nationally only, but it was defeated in the Senate. And there is what we effectively have now, an executive, non-binding, consultative plebiscite or seeking of views. And then, of course, there's always the argument that this really should have been decided by Parliament itself without any reference to the people. And I'll open that to discussion. Jai.
Sure, well, I'm happy to kick that off. I personally believe that despite the High Court going well beyond what it was asked to consider in the ACT versus Commonwealth matter, that these things should be interpreted with the original intention. And not only, thank you, and not only is the Marriage Act, I suppose, entrenching what we know people understood from the time that that document speaks, but as David pointed out, we know that because the commentary from Quick and Garran is testimony to that. So to me, this is something which is almost unconstitutional and should have been put to the people. But the reality is today we're faced with a situation where at any given time an act could be passed by Parliament and probably would be upheld when it comes before the High Court. So from the other matters that we have to consider, I suppose it's the political realities that have dictated the way that it's gone through the postal mechanism. I have very serious concerns about that mechanism itself. I think that we've seen reports of people receiving several copies of letters to people who used to live and still remain on the roll at those addresses and have proudly claimed, most of them claiming that they would be voting yes, I would point out, but pointing out that they have voted on those additional forms. And the second thing is the security of the ballot, where you can hold that up to a light, and I'm sure that everybody's seen it on their copy, and see the contents of that envelope. So to think that the security of the vote which has gone out would be so fundamentally flawed is just absolutely dismal. But to me, this is something which should be put to the people. It should be a referendum, and if the proponents of such change truly believe that there is such strong support in the community, they should welcome a funded yes/no campaign with a yes/no booklet that would go to every elector. I don't know if you can hear that. That would go to every elector, and if it follows the same model as what the 1999 model did, it would be alternate pages that everybody would have an opportunity to consider.
Any other members of the panel wish to comment?
I concur wholeheartedly with what Jai has said. Some time ago, down in not this venue, but the other place where we came to. No. It was down here in Melbourne. We discussed that, and I pointed out at the time the wording of Quick and Garran. But my biggest thing about this whole process, regardless of which way it ends up, the Parliament can still change it at any time down the road. It won't be going away soon. So that's why I would back a referendum any day. I think we should be very wary of whatever your thoughts are, whether it's yes or no. The thing is this, that whatever gets up still can be changed by the Parliament in the future.
If I could just quickly add one more point to what I said, and David did mention that in those slides, but I think it's worth reinforcing, that the referendum, despite the fact that the plebiscite couldn't pass through, was still a definite option, because if it was rejected by the Senate, it could have been put again 3 months later, and if rejected a second time, I understand the Governor-General can actually sign off on that. So that would have definitely been a political reality had they chosen to do so.
Damien, did you wish to comment?
Well, I have to say I agree with you, David. I'm an originalist too.
I'm so pleased.
Should come as no surprise to know that there are some things we agree about after a very long time.
The crown.
Indeed. I mean, I probably take a slightly different view, though. That I think it must be that that the original power, I think, is a bit broader than you conceive of it being, because it seems to me that surely the Founding Fathers intended that the Parliament could make a law prohibiting polygamy, for instance. Polygamy is not within the Christian definition of marriage, and it must have been part of the original intention.
Wouldn't that be incidental?
Well, the point is, if you could say that it was illegal, if you could outlaw it, then you must have the power to make it legal as well. That if the Parliament has the power to say you can't have a polygamous marriage, it must have the power to say you can have a polygamous marriage. So in that sense, I would probably see it a bit differently. If they have the power to say same-sex couples can't get married, then they must have the power to say they can get married. That said, I agree with you completely that we should be originalists, and maybe my understanding of what they meant is wrong, but I'd be happy to accept that if that's the case. But yeah, that would be my only qualification on that point.
Thank you. Yes, a question. And the microphone is coming.
Just a statement on that. We know that the Federation Fathers drew a lot from the experience, the 19th century experience of, they drew the Federation from America and Canada, they drew the referendum from Switzerland, And it also seems to me that on with the marriage power in the Constitution, that they drew on the experience, as far as I understand it, of marriage law as it prevails in America, that there are different laws which prevail in each of the American states. And I'd say that the one in the area where the Mormons are, in Utah, that was a matter that had to be resolved by the American Federalists because of that. But in Australia, it was a matter of what laws could apply uniformly throughout the new Commonwealth, leaving aside those which would be characteristic of a particular or a tradition of a particular colony, and that they wanted the same marriage laws to prevail throughout the Australian Commonwealth. And I certainly know as a marriage celebrant that in completing marriage documentation, that it's something I can celebrate a wedding in Melbourne or in Sydney, and the same law applies. It's the same. So the same law applies throughout. I'm not having to consider, or acknowledge different the laws of Victoria or the laws of New South Wales as far as marriage law is concerned.
The American Constitution does not give a marriage power to the federal authorities, to the Congress. That didn't stop the Supreme Court, from finding that under the Bill of Rights that there was a right to same-sex marriage. So it's very hard to control judges, but in Australia it is a shared power, but of course the Commonwealth power prevails.
Marriage law exists. There's the Commonwealth law, and then of course the statistics are gathered by the states. So each state has its own registry. And
once John Howard initiated that legislation, which I think was adopted unanimously, was it not? That to adopt that definition of marriage as a marriage between a man and a woman, I think Labor supported him on that. That then occupied the field, and therefore there was no room for the states, and certainly not the territories, which are not states, to introduce contradictory legislation.
Yes, David, if I can just make a comment. I proudly voted no, and I wish I had a few more envelopes. I would have voted no again and no again. But the big worry...
We won't report you.
Sorry?
We won't report you.
I'll tell old Bill Shorten. But the big worry is that, what if I was a caterer or a minister, and as a minister refused to marry a gay couple? Where do I stand legally with that if this same-sex marriage comes in? Or if I was a caterer and I said, no, look, I don't want to, prepare any food for you or make a cake or whatever, where do I stand legally on all that? Would somebody like to answer that?
Senator?
A very good question. So for your background, I'm in favour of changing the law to permit same-sex couples to marry, but like you, I share your concern about what the flow-on consequences of that could be. And the most truthful answer to your question is there could be negative flow-on consequences for others, but there doesn't have to be. The Parliament can deal with this to ensure that there aren't those flow-on consequences you fear. So there are a couple of draft private members' bills already which exist to draw the line of where religious freedom and freedom of conscience and freedom of speech would be if we were to change the law to allow gay couples to marry. The most prominent is one by Dean Smith. Dean Smith's bill is better than most in some respects in that it better protects the right of religious ministers to refuse to participate in weddings. Not only does it protect a minister of religion to refuse, it also protects the right of someone who is a marriage celebrant who has religious beliefs to also refuse to participate in a same-sex wedding. Most other bills have required all celebrants, regardless of whether they had religious views or not, to participate in same-sex weddings if asked. Dean Smith's bill also protects religious institutions, including churches and religious schools, and allows them to refuse, for example, for their premises to be used for a same-sex wedding. But where it doesn't go any further and doesn't attempt to go any further is for people of faith who have an objection to the change in marriage who are not directly connected to a religious institution. So they're not a priest, they're not an imam, they're not a rabbi. So you could be, as you say, a Christian baker or a Christian wedding photographer or of any faith, and you are not. There is no protections in the Dean Smith bill for people like you, and I'm concerned about those people, and I think the protections should go further. The reason that I think they should go further is because religious freedom is not a freedom that only exists for churches and for people who are employed by churches. It's a universal human right. and it has no meaning at all if only priests have it and you and I don't. So I think the protections need to extend to protect those people. And if there is a yes result in the postal survey, there's going to be a very interesting couple of weeks in the Parliament where we debate exactly where those lines are drawn. I'll be advocating that we draw them further out rather than narrower, but there'll be others who have a different view. So I don't know exactly where the Parliament will land.
If I could just add a comment to that. If there were protections, even if they were to go as far as you suggest they should be extended, what's the guarantee? What is the guarantee that a future Parliament won't repeal those protections?
There is no guarantee, just like there's no guarantee with any other piece of legislation that it will remain there forever. No current Parliament can bind future Parliaments. The best guarantee is that we inculcate a culture of respecting people's rights and individual liberties, and that's a big task that we all have to engage in. I actually think that task is supported by granting gay couples the freedom to marry, because if you've been on the side of denying gay couples the freedom to marry, you're not in a very strong position to then argue that the freedom of those who object to that should have their freedoms to be protected. I think as someone who has argued in favour of granting that freedom to gay couples, I will be in the strongest possible position to argue that the freedom of others needs to be respected in that process. So the best I can do is give you a commitment that I'll be arguing very strongly for it for as long as I'm in the Parliament, but I can't guarantee that the law will stay as it is forever.
You could perhaps argue for a referendum, not 51-21 marriage, but a 51-21A. Have a separate provision saying same-sex marriage, provided that existing freedoms of speech and of religion and standards in schools are not in any way affected by it. Something which then locks into the Constitution an inability for this to have any other effect than people getting married.
While I certainly understand the merits of that from reassuring people today, I think there is grave danger in going down that path in treating the Constitution like it is just a permanent piece of legislation and we can add whatever political values we have today to it in order to keep it there for as long as possible. If we were to open that door on things like that, imagine what the left would want to insert in the Constitution in return and what they would like to embed in there now. I think that would be a very dangerous path to go down.
In reply, Senator, these are eternal values. Yes. Yes.
I'm speaking.
Yes, and they're bringing a microphone to you.
Oh, thank you. I come into this as an amateur and asking question. I just see perhaps as a view of semantics. Now, homosexuals don't want to be called heterosexuals or vice versa. They're two different things and there's two different words. You know, table and chair, two different words. People who are gay don't want to be called straight or vice versa. They're happy with two different words for two different things. And now, as I understand legally, there is no difficulty as it stands at the moment, and as I said, I'm an amateur, so that suddenly we can't have two words for two different things. Of course, we talk about civil unions, or you can make up any word you like, that said these are this is that for this and this is this for this. It's a different thing and they can have their very own word, and I don't see why there's any inferiority or prejudice or anything. It would be accepted just like any other.
Thank you. And if you... Yes.
Sorry, could I?
And then the lady there.
Oh, sorry, could I
Yes.
reply to that? Look. One of the things that the advocates of identity politics are extremely well adapted to is changing the language to make it mean what they want. And you see the word sex, which you know, Jane Austen used to talk about the opposite sex, the fairer sex, etc., has been largely replaced by the word gender. And that was because the word sex is binary. You're either one or the other, and there is no in-betweens. Whereas gender, which is a term you hear in Parliament all the time, even by people, I've even heard John Howard use the term, it's a left-wing political concept taken from linguistics. It doesn't come from biology, to pretend that even though the cells in a man are men's cells, all the cells and all the billions of cells in a woman are different, despite that fundamental biological difference, we can have social differences, and their adaptation of gender fluidity and using the word gender means that if they want to change the word marriage or invent a new term for marriage, then Conservatives will sit by with their mouths wide open, their jaws dropping, saying, "Gosh, that's a Swiftie they pulled on us, but we can't do anything about it," because language wars have been going on for as long as the culture wars, and Conservatives have lost for decade after decade.
David, that's very opposite to what I wanted to ask. A very senior member of the coalition told me quite recently, within the last couple of weeks, that one of the advantages of a plebiscite is you don't have to expose the legislation beforehand, and that within the party room, consideration was being given to a list of genders, which he told me, the number I forget, but it was a very large list of genders. I mean, much more than the 7 or 8 that we hear of, much more. And that the purpose of this, included in legislation, was so that if anyone objected to the same-sex, the safe-sex program in schools, they could be pointed to the fact that this is already law, it's in the Marriage Act. Now, this is the kind of protection that is needed. This is Marxist inversion, perversion, conversion. It's a process of brainwashing. Tip the language and the values upside down, get people doing those things, that's perversion, and then convert them, say, look, you're a bunch of animals, you need to change to our way of thinking. Now, that's been going on, to my knowledge, for 50 years. And this is a fairly extreme example of it.
Just a quick comment on that, David. I sat on the Senate inquiry that looked into religious freedom and marriage that was chaired by Senator David Fawcett, and we looked at basically all the options that have been proposed so far. I'm not aware of any single option to change the law that makes any specific reference to genders in the way that you're referring. What they all propose to do is, rather than, as it currently says, that marriage is between a man and a woman, to change it to marriage is between two adults. I absolutely understand your concerns about, and here in Victoria we particularly understand your concerns about safe schools, and the number I think is 63 possible genders that you could have. So, I've never heard it being quite that high, but 63 is I think enough already. And look, for your background, I was one of the kind of early leading opponents of the Safe Schools movement in the federal coalition, and we stopped the federal government funding it, but we obviously still have a task on our hands here in Victoria to stop it. And I think the point about Safe Schools is that it was introduced before we've had same-sex marriage. Whether or not the law changes next month to have same-sex marriage, we will still have Safe Schools in Victoria, and we need to defeat it separately from same-sex marriage.
I draw everyone's attention to the fact that I carefully chose a photograph of a wedding cake which is gender neutral. Yes. And then Father.
I just wanted to say that keep it simple. The meaning of marriage is between a man and a woman, and for the procreation of and to protect the children of that marriage. Keep it simple and not bring in more and more and more laws to counteract. And the other thing is you're going to open a Pandora's box, which of course the communists and the Marxists want.
One thing that really bothers me is that we keep on hearing policy makers and politicians using this term LGBTQ blah 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 community. It is not a community. It is an acronym that is a Marxist acronym. There is no such thing as an LGBT community. They have no common identity. The L and the G have got very little in common. The G's and the T's don't really have anything to do with each other and don't want to. I mean, it's a fiction. And everything is being revolving around this great lie. And we're so sucked in by it. And it's going to cause a lot of problems if we don't stop it now.
Good. And Nella and the...
Senator, I'm a bit surprised at your view, to be honest with you, especially when Senator Penny Wong, last year, along with Bill Shorten, specifically said that if they were in power, one, they would change the Act, two, they would install an LGBTIQI commissioner to police. So I'm a bit surprised that you would actually risk that to happen, considering that chances are you may lose the next election and you may not even be there, and yet you go and make a decision that's going to have ongoing consequences for us.
Well, if you're right, and if we do lose the election, what will we be able to do to stop them from doing that?
I'm hoping that a decision in Parliament is going to be made before you go to the next election, so at least it'll be a definite no now rather than later.
But
and maybe we need to get your act together. For the Liberal Party needs to get the act together so they don't lose the next election.
Well,
and this is one of the issues.
Sure. I mean, I'm just taking up your point that you think we're going to lose, and if you're right that we lose, then Labor Party will control the Parliament and they'll do what they want to do on this issue. They've said no matter what the result of the survey is, they intend to legislate for same-sex marriage if they are elected. Now, like you, I hope they're not elected, but we will respect the outcome of the survey one way or the other. So there's either a chance that there will be a yes vote under our watch and we'll legislate it, there'll be a no vote under our watch and we won't legislate it, we'll win the next election and then it'll be determined in the next Parliament, or we'll lose the next election and the Labor Party will do it straight away. So my view is that means it's very high, like in 3 out of those 4 scenarios, then we're going to have same-sex marriage in some form in this country. Now my view is, given that that is in the overwhelming likelihood, it is much more preferable that the time that it happens is on our watch and on our terms, and people like me are going to have influence on that outcome about religious freedom, freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. Because if it happens on someone else's watch, I'll have no influence on that outcome and no one will want to hear what I have to say about religious liberty and other issues. If we're able to embed in the first time that same-sex marriage is legalised strong protections, it will be much harder to unwind those protections than the alternative scenario, which is they bring it in afresh in their own government and those protections will never be there in the first place.
Thank you, Damien.
Could I just pick up on the previous comment about the use of the word community? I mean, I agree with you. I think the problems are even bigger than that. It's this obsession. Every interest group now is redefined as a community. I mean, this obsession with communities where, you know, it's a really big problem, I think, in this, the way people are using this word community that goes beyond this specific case. It's not a good thing, yeah.
And the last question for Peter.
Yeah, just quickly, we hear this word love, love, love all the time. It's going to be very, very interesting if this same-sex marriage gets through, and let's say 5 years down the track, just see how many go through the divorce courts.
Thank you.